So today I'm reading a selection from The Lilac Bus by Maeve Binchy. Maeve Binchy is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her name. She wrote, I don't even know how many countless novels. Most of them are actually, I think all of them based in Ireland. This one is about a group of people who take quite literally a lavender-colored minibus from Dublin back to their hometown in Ireland every weekend to spend time with their families. So each chapter of the book follows a different character from the bus. So that's what kind of makes it a collection of short stories. So today I'm going to read the chapter on Mikey. Mikey always said that you couldn't come across a nicer crowd of girls than the ones who worked in the bank. The men were grand fellows too, but they were often busy with their careers and they wouldn't have all the time to talk. And one of the men, a young buck who'd some kind of high manager before he was 30, had taken it upon himself to say to Mikey that it would be appreciated if he watched his sense of humor, since the bank ladies had found it rather coarse on occasion. Mikey had been very embarrassed and had said nothing all day. So silent was he that the nice Anna Kelly, who was pure gold, asked him if he felt all right. He had told her what the young buck said, and Anna Kelly had said that banks were stuffy old places, and maybe the buck had a point. Jokes were fine with friends, but God, the bank. It wouldn't know how to laugh if you were tickling its funny bone for a year. So he understood now, and he never uttered a pleasantry within the bank walls again. If he met them on the street, that was different. He could pass a remark or make a joke like anyone then, because they were all on neutral ground. And he used to tell the girls about his family in Rathdown. Well, about the family that Billy and Mary had, really. The twins with the red hair and the freckles, and then Greta with the pigtails, and the baby, a big roll of butter with a laugh you could hear half a mile away. He told Anna Kelly that sometimes on the summer evenings, when it would be very bright, the twins wouldn't have gone to bed, and they'd be sitting at their windows waiting till the Lilac bus turned into the street and Uncle Mikey would get off. They collected stamps and badges, any kind of badges, and he had them all on the lookout for anything of that order, so as he never went home empty-handed. He was the only one of the bank porters who came from the country. The rest were all Dubliners. They used to laugh at him and say they'd have to be an official inquiry as to how he got the job. But they were a very good-natured lot, and there was a great chat all day as they manned the doors or wheeled the big boxes on trolleys, where and when more money was needed or had to be put away. They delivered letters and documents up and down the street. They knew a lot of the customers by name, and they got great Christmas presents altogether. The Lilac bus had started just when Mikey had needed it. His father was getting senile now, and it was hard on poor Billy and Mary to have the whole business of looking after him. But it would have been a long way to come back without Tom Fitzgerald and the little minibus that dropped you at the door. Imagine having to get yourself to the town by a crowded train, packed on a Friday night, and maybe not a seat. And then after that, try to organize the 17 miles home. It would take all day and all night, and you'd be exhausted. His old father was pleased to see him sometimes, but other times the old man didn't seem to know who he was. Mikey would take his turn spooning the food and combing the matted hair. He would play the Sousa marches his father liked on the record player, and put the dirty clothes in the big buckets of Dettol and water out in the back. Mary, who was Billy's wife and a sort of a saint, said that there was no problem if you thought of it all as children's nappies. Into a bucket of disinfectant for a while, throw that out, into a bucket of water a while, and throw that out, and then wash them. Weren't they lucky to have a space out the back and a tap and a drain and all? It would be desperate altogether for people who lived in a flat. And the nurse came twice a week, and she was very good too. She even said once to Mikey that he needn't come back every weekend. It was above the call of duty. But Mikey said that he couldn't leave it all to Billy and Mary. It wasn't fair. And they'd be getting the house. What would Mikey be getting? The nurse had pointed out. Mikey said that sort of thing didn't come into it. And anyway, wasn't it a grand thing to come back to your own place? The twins told Mikey that there was never any fighting when he came home, and Mikey was surprised. "Why would there be fighting in this house?" he asked. The twins shrugged. Phil and Patty were afraid of being disloyal. "Sure you couldn't be fighting with your poor old grandfather. He would never harm the hair of your heads," Mikey said. The twins agreed, and the matter was dropped. They loved Mikey around the house, and he had a fund of jokes for them. Not risque ones, of course, but ones they could tell anyone. Greta even wrote them down sometimes that she'd remember them to tell them in class. Mikey never told the same one twice. They told him he should be on television telling them one after another with a studio audience. Mikey loved the notion of it. He had once hoped that he might be asked to do a turn for the Bank's Review, but nobody had suggested it. And when he had whispered it to that nice Anna Kelly, she had said she had heard that you had to be a member of the union to be invited, that only members of the IBOA were allowed to perform. And he'd been pleased to know that, because otherwise he would have felt they were passing him over. He had his doubts about the Lilac bus when he arrived the very first Friday. Thomas Fitzgerald had asked them to be sure not to wave any money at him, because the legalities of the whole thing were what you might call a gray area. He did have the proper insurance and everything, and the Lilac bus had a passenger service vehicle license, but there was no point in courting disaster. Let them all give him the money when they were home in Rathdown, where it would be nice and calm. None of them had understood the ins and outs of it, but they had all agreed. Mikey wondered if people like Dr. Burke's daughter and Mr. Green's son Rupert would fancy sharing a journey home with Mikey Burns, the bank porter and the son of poor Joey Burns, who before he lost his wits had been a great man for standing waiting till Ryan's pub opened and nothing much else. But if Dee and Rupert were the salt of the earth, it turned out, there wasn't an ounce of snobbery between them. And Mrs. Hickey was a lady too, but she always seemed pleased to see him. Nancy Morris was the same as she always had been since she was a schoolgirl, awkward and self-conscious. Nothing would get her out of that. She'd be an old maid yet. Celia Ryan was another fish altogether. It was a mystery she hadn't married someone by now. She always looked as if her mind was far away, yet she thought to be a powerful nurse. He knew a man who'd been in Celia's ward, and he couldn't speak highly enough of her. He said she was like a legend in the hospital. Nowadays, he enjoyed the journey home after he'd got over his shyness of the first few runs. He would tell them a joke or two. They weren't a great audience, not like Greta and Phil and Patty, but they did smile and laugh a little, and didn't it cheer them up? Sometimes he sat beside Celia, and he would tell her the tales of the world of banking. He told her of all the new machines and the days of bank inspections, and how the tourists would drive you mad, and how in the summer you'd have a line half a mile long of Spanish and French students all wanting to change about £1 each of their foreign money. Celia didn't tell many tales of the hospital, but she often gave him helpful advice about his own father, in a low voice so that the others didn't hear her talking about incontinence pads and Velcro fastenings for clothes. But tonight it was the young Kennedy fellow sitting beside him. There was something seriously wrong with that boy. His brothers Bart and Eddie were the nicest fellows you could meet in a day's walk, but whatever had happened to young Kev, he looked as if he had seen the day of judgment. You only had to address a civil word to him to have him leap out of his skin. Try to tell him a good story, and he'd miss the point altogether. Mikey thought he'd teach him a few tricks that might be of use to him, to be able to do a trick in a pub. But the young fellow looked at him with the two eyes staring out of his head and didn't take in a word of it. In the end, Mikey let him be, staring out the window as if the goblins were going to leap out of the hedges and climb into the bus after them. Mikey nodded off. It was easy to sleep in the bus. The two girls behind him were already asleep, dreaming of fellows probably. Mikey dreamed that his father was well and strong again and had opened some kind of import and export agency in Rathdown, and that he, Mikey, was the manager, and that he was able to give grand summer jobs to Phil and Patty and Greta, delivering letters to people up and down the street. He often dreamed of the children, but he never saw a wife for himself in the dream. Mikey Burns had missed the boat as far as wives were concerned. Too nervous and idioty at the time, he should have been looking for one. And now at 45, he wasn't the kind of 45-year-old that would be in a race at all. Better not make a fool of yourself going to dances or picking up fast-knowing women in pubs and being made to look thick altogether. When they crossed the river and they were really in the west, they paused for the 10-minute comfort stop and the half pint to open the throat a bit. Celia came up to him quietly and put an envelope into his hand. That's for the bed sores. It's all written on it. Keep him moving as much as you can. Oh, Celia, you're terribly good. Can I pay you for this? Are you mad, Mikey? Do you think I paid for it? Dublin Health Authority would like you to have it as a little gift. They laughed. She was very nice. What a pity he hadn't found a grand girl like Celia when he was young and promising looking. After all, he had a grand, well-paid job now. He'd be able to make a home for anyone. The reason he didn't really have one wasn't money. It was the lack of interest. He couldn't be buying a place and furnishing it and getting tables and chairs in it all for himself. The room he rented was grand and comfortable, and he denied himself nothing. He had a grand big telly, and he had bought himself a mirror to fix in the front of the wardrobe, the way he'd go out properly dressed. Besides the bed, he had a lovely radio, which was a lamp and a clock and an alarm all in one. When he went out to people's houses, and the Dublin fellows often invited him up to their places, he was always able to bring a big box of chocolates, a fancy one with a ribbon on it. He was able to give a good account of himself. But when he'd been a young lad, who were they, except the sons of poor Joey Burns and his mother, who'd taken in washing and cleaned people's floors? It hadn't held Billy back. Billy strutted around Rathdown as if he owned it, as if he were as good as any other citizen of the place. And wasn't he right? Look where he was now. He had all kinds of business interests. He employed 5 people in Rathdown. He had the takeaway shop. Nobody believed there was a need for it until it appeared. Half the families in the place ate Billy's chicken and chips on a Saturday night, and they had fried fish too and hamburgers. They sold cans of lemonade and stayed open late to get the crowds going home from Ryan's. And Billy had put up 2 huge mesh litter bins at his own expense, and everyone was delighted with him. And then he had an insurance business as well. Not a big one, but anyone who wanted cover went through him, and it could all be filled in quickly in the house. And he had some kind of connection with a fellow who came in to do macadaming. If he wanted the front of the place all smartened up, then Billy would get other people with their places facing the same way to agree, and the man with the machine and the tar would come, and it was cheaper for everyone, and the place looked a king to what it looked before. A whole section of the main street looked really smart now, and Billy had got a tree planted in a tub, and it was like something you'd see in a film. Billy had the brains, and Billy never ran away the way Mikey ran off to Dublin after his mother had died. Billy had stayed to marry Mary Moran, who was way beyond anyone they'd ever have thought about, or that Mikey would have thought about. He was looking forward to being home tonight. He had a computer game for the twins' birthday. There were several cuts above the Space Invaders they had tried out once, and it could be plugged into any kind of television. He had been playing it on his own television all week, but the shop assistant said it would work as well on a smaller set. The twins had their birthday on Monday, and he was going to give them the game on Sunday afternoon. He would set up the room with the curtains pulled and pretend they were going to watch something on the television, and then would come the surprise. He had got a smart red girl's handbag for Greta, even though it wasn't her birthday, because he didn't want her to be left out, and a yellow rabbit for the baby in case it might have feelings of discontent in its pram. Mary would never let him near his father on the Friday night. She'd have a supper warm for him, or if it had been a busy day, she'd run across the road to the family takeaway and get him fish and chips as soon as she saw the Lilac bus pull up. She used to thank him so much for coming back to help with his father, and she'd tell him funny things about the children and what they had done during the week. They were back at school now, so there would be tales of what Devilment Phil had got up to, and the threatening messages that came home about him from the brothers. Mikey was the second to get out. They would leave Dr. Burke's daughter up at the golf club entrance. Her parents were always there of a Friday night, and she'd go and join them. Then when it came to the end of the street, the first drop was Mikey. He would take down Nancy Morris's huge suitcase, which weighed as light as a feather, and leave it inside the bus because she and Kev Kennedy would be out next. And Kev had nothing with him ever except a parcel that he kept under his seat. Mikey advised them all to be good, and if they couldn't, they should be clever, and if they couldn't be clever, then they should buy a pram. He laughed happily and closed the door behind him. There was no light in the kitchen and no meal on the table. There was no sign of Mary and no note either. He didn't mind not seeing Billy. His brother was usually up at the takeaway or in Ryan's doing some deal with someone. But Mary? He looked in the other rooms. His father was asleep, mouth open, wheelchair near the bed. On the chair was a large chamber pot, optimistic since the old man was never able to time things so accurately. There was a smell of disinfectant mixed with better smells. Mary had big bunches of flowers around the room. She always said that she thought it cheered the old man up, and sometimes she had seen him stretch out and touch the flowers gently. He snored lightly. There was a nightlight and a Sacred Heart lamp as well. Then Mikey went up the stairs quietly. The twins had bunk beds. Their toys and clothes and books were all around. Phil slept in a ball with his fists clenched. Addie was more peaceful, lying on his side. Greta looked funny with her long straight hair brushed out. He remembered her with plaits for as long as she had been old enough to force her hair into them. She had a smile as if she were dreaming. She was a thin little thing, gawky and plain looking, but she had a smile that would tear the heart out of you, even if she was asleep. The door of Billy and Mary's bedroom was open. They weren't there. The baby, round and soft like a cream bun, lay in its cot near the bed. There was a lovely white lacy bedspread, and on the wall there was a picture of Our Lady in a field of flowers. It had a blue lamp lighting under it. It was called Queen of the May. Mary told Mikey once that the day she and Billy got engaged, he had won a competition at a carnival where you had to throw rings over things, and he had chosen that picture for her because she liked it so much. Mikey put his small bag in his own room, which was neat as anything. She always had a bright, clean pillow slip on the top, as if he was the highest quality coming for the weekend. Sometimes Mikey's mind went back to what the house had looked like in his mother's day, when they hadn't any such style or time for it. It was puzzling, but maybe she had gone to get him fish and chips. He waited downstairs and listened to the news on the television. Eventually, he began to get worried. They never left the children all alone in the house, even though they were perfectly safe. But it was just the way they were. His anxiety increased. He walked across to the takeaway, and to his surprise, there was Mary serving. There were 4 people waiting for their order, and only one of the young girls who worked there was behind the counter. They were working flat out. Mikey, Lord, is it that time already? She was pleased but flustered to see him. Well, I get behind there and give you a hand. He knew the way. He had done it with them a few Saturday nights during the summer when they had been very busy, and the prices were on the wall. Oh, Mikey, would you? She was grateful. He hung up his jacket and took an apron from a drawer. In a few moments, they had the crowd thinned, and Mary was able to draw breath again. She spoke first to the girl who worked there. Teresa, would you take off your apron like a good child and run up to Ryan's? Tell them that we're short-staffed tonight and we'll be closing early. Tell them if they want anything to come down in the next half hour for it, otherwise they'll be disappointed. Who will I tell, ma'am? The child seemed worried. That's a point. Not much use telling poor Mrs. Ryan these days. Let me see. If there's anyone behind the bar helping, like Bart Kennedy, anyone like that, someone who looks in charge. Celia's home. She was on the bus. She'll probably have got behind the counter by now, Mikey said. That's it. Tell Celia. Teresa skipped off up the road, pleased to be out of the heat. Where is everyone? Mikey looked around. Oh, there's been a lot happening. I'll tell you all when we get back. Keep a brave face on for half an hour more, and then it will be done. A trickle of people came in, and Mikey served them. And just as Mary had guessed would happen, a great influx came from Ryan's pub. They were full of good-natured abuse about it being against the law of the land to close the chipper before the pub. Mary had laughed good-naturedly and said wasn't she going above and beyond the call of duty to let them know now, rather than have them going home with stomachs full of beer and nothing to soak it up. She didn't want a portion for herself, so Mikey wrapped up his own choice, and when they had drained the fat, scrubbed the tops, and swept up anything that could be swept up into black plastic bags, which were tied with little wires at the top, they crossed the street and went home. Mary heated a plate under the hot water tap, got out the tomato sauce, and some bread and butter. Will I wet you tea, or would you like a drop of anything? They got a bottle of Guinness each and sat down. Billy's gone for good. He stared at her, fork halfway to his mouth. He went this day before lunch. He'll not be back, ever. Ah, no, Mary, that's not possible. She took a sip of her drink and made a face. I never liked the first sip, but it tastes grand after that." She smiled a weak little smile. Mikey swallowed and said, "It was just a bit of a row, that's all. People have rows. They get patched up." No, there was no row. There was no difference of opinion even. Mikey remembered the way the twins had said there was no fighting when he was around the place. "But just a bit of Barney now and then. These things sort themselves out, really they do." He was pleading now. "No, I'll tell you it from the start to finish. There was no row. Back there early on in the summer, we did have rows all right. He was very touchy. I thought, bite the head off you as soon as look at you. But he said that's the way I was too. The children even noticed. So what happened? Well, I don't know honestly, but anyway, we had a great summer, as you know. Business was booming. He used to be tired, but he never came cross anymore. And what with the baby getting to be so grand, you know they're like devils the first few weeks. Anyway, we hadn't a worry under the sun." She stopped and looked away beyond him. Mikey was silent. "Eat up your fish and chips, Mikey. You can eat and listen." "I can't." She lifted the plate from him and put it into the oven very low down. "You'll eat it later then." Today was when it all happened, and if I hadn't come back, I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have known at this moment. I wouldn't have known until the next week. The whole of Rathdown would have known before me. Known what, for God's sake? He's gone off with Eileen Walsh. You know, the one we said was too good to be working in a chipper? Well, she was far too good. She was only biding her time to go off with the owner of the chipper. That was the little plan. Could you beat it? The voice was steady, but the eyes were overbright. "But it's only a fancy, isn't it? A bit of madness, I mean. Where would they go? What would they do? And how could he leave you and the baby and the whole family? He's in love with her. That's the word, in love. Isn't it marvelous? He was never in love with me. He loved me, of course, but that was apparently different." Mikey stood up, and he didn't know what to do, so he sat down again. Mary went on with the story. "I was meant to be going into the town. There's always a lift in on Fridays, and I had a list of things needed for the takeaway. Not things we get from the suppliers, but stupid things. Big ashtrays, for example, and a couple of tins of bright red paint. We were going to paint the windows to match the geraniums. Can you believe it? But to go on with what happened, you know old Mrs. Casey, who's only just learned to drive. Well, she was giving me the lift, and as soon as we were out on the road beyond the golf club, didn't the engine sputter and make these desperate sounds? Ah, well, I said to myself, there's my day in town gone for its tea. But she's such a nice woman, Mrs. Casey, you couldn't offend her. I told her it was a blessing in disguise, and I could get the things next week, and maybe I'd go home and make an apple tart since Mikey'd be coming back on the bus tonight." A big lump came up in Mikey's throat. "And I said to her to sit tight, I'll walk back and tell the Brennans in the garage to go out for her." Mary took another sip. "It was a gorgeous day, and I picked wildflowers from the hedges. And when I came in, there was Billy at the table with a whole load of papers all around him. I was delighted because he was meant to have been gone for the day. So I said, wasn't this grand, and we'd have a bit of lunch, the two of us, something we hadn't done in years. And I saw that there was a Dear Mary on a piece of paper, and on another, and only 2 or 3 lines on each, and I still didn't know anything was wrong. So I said, are you writing me love letters at my age, as kind of a joke? You see, I thought he was just back unexpectedly and was writing me a note to explain that he'd been in." "Oh, Mary, isn't this terrible?" said Mikey, believing it for the first time since the saga started. "This is the awful bit. He started to cry. He started to cry like a child. Well, I nearly dropped dead. Billy Burns crying? I ran to him to try and put my arms around him, and he pushed me away. He was sobbing like a baby that's getting teeth. So I said to him to hush it down or his father would hear. I'd left the baby next door, but your father would have been having a doze, and it would have frightened the daylights out of him like it was doing to me." She paused for a moment. "Then he said about Eileen and her expecting and all." There was a silence, and the clock ticked, and the soft snoring sound of the old man could be heard from the back room. "He said he couldn't face me, and he was leaving a letter. And I said that he didn't have to go now, not at once, that surely he could stay and we could talk about what was to be done. But he said there'd been too much talking, and that was it. Now he was going." Mikey put out his big hand and patted Mary's arm hopelessly. "There was a lot of this and that, but funny, no fight, no shouts, or me saying he was a bastard, or him saying he couldn't bear me anymore. that I was an old nag or anything. Well, no one could think that, Mikey cried loyally. No, he said I'd been the best wife and mother in the world, and that he couldn't tell me how sorry he was. He was just heartbroken, he said. All the papers were to show me that the chip shop is in my name, and that £1,000 in the building society is for me, and the name of the solicitor who'd be able to find him, who'd pass letters on. And where does he think he's going? To England. Where else? How will he earn a living for himself in this floozy? She's not a floozy, Eileen a floozy. Billy would earn a living on the planet Mars. Don't worry about that. Mikey was struck dumb. But the thing that upset him most was his father, your father. Billy never gives much time to poor old Dad. No, but he thought it wasn't just for me to be left with him, to have to look after an old man who isn't my own father. I said that Da was the least of my problems, that I wanted to know how he could leave me, his wife, his friend, for years and years. For 14 years married, and a year before that mad about each other. That's what he explained all this in love business. What did you do? What could I do? His mind was made up. He was leaving. He had a list of things he wanted me to do. There was a special sum of money left in one envelope that was for me to have driving lessons. I was to find out who taught Mrs. Casey. Whoever taught her could teach the devil himself. He was leaving the van. I was to ask Bart Kennedy to give me a hand and pay him a proper wage. I was to decide whether he should write to the children or not, and what I should tell them, if anything. He thought I should say he had gone away for a bit, and that they'd grow used to it. Mary stood up to get another bottle of stout. He had been packing his things too. It nearly broke my heart to see all his good shirts stuffed and all creased, and he had forgotten about all his shoes. I asked him to say goodbye to your father. He's been very clear the past couple of days, knows all of us, but no, he wouldn't. I said he might never see him again, and he said that he'd never see any of us again. That's when I got a bit frightened about it all. I knew there's never any changing his mind, so I decided to let him go without screaming and roaring and begging. You let him walk out? No, I said I'd go out and let him finish at his ease. I said he needn't bother about the letter now. He'd said it all. That I'd go out and get more flowers and things to keep out of his way for an hour or two until he left. Then he could leave all the insurance papers where they could be found, and the solicitor who would pass on messages to him if there was anything we hadn't thought of. He was so relieved. You should have seen his face. You see, he was afraid there'd be this big scene. He said that maybe I'd be glad of the change too. And I said, oh, no, I wouldn't. I would miss him every day of the year, and so would his children. And on the days when his father was clear, his father would miss him too. I wasn't going to give him the nice, comfortable feeling that he was doing us any favors. So out I went. I crept along the back way, and he finished his packing and his leaving things out on the table. And your one came along in her car, and he put the boxes and cases in, and she kissed him just standing at our door, and they drove off. When I came in, it was all in neat piles on the table and a piece of paper saying, thank you very much, Mary. All the best, Billy. So now you know everything that's to be known. Isn't he a callous bastard? Isn't he the biggest, most selfish? That won't bring him back. I'll bring him back. I'll get him back. He's not deserting you. There's ways of bringing him back. Not if he doesn't want to come back. Will you have your fish and chips now? They'll go all hard otherwise. He hardly slept all night. It was only when the dawn came that he fell off, and it wasn't long after that the twins were in the room, followed by Greta carrying a cup of tea. That was always their excuse to wake him. It was called bringing him his tea in bed. Most of it was the saucer, and some of it was on the stairs, but it was still an excuse. They were full of plans for the day. They'd come down and wait a while he was feeding Grandpa and changing him. They accepted that routine as part of life, like sunsets or having to wash your hands before meals. They wanted to show him a new game that had arrived in Brophy's shop. It was a huge thing, like a Space Invaders, but it cost 20 pence a time, and they could only have 3 goes altogether, unless, of course, Uncle Mikey wanted an extra game. And Mammy had said that they could all go on a picnic in the afternoon, because since Daddy was gone to Dublin for a bit, there'd be no work to be done around the house, and no one coming in about insurance would have to have tea. And hadn't he better get up now in case all the good went out of the day? Mikey felt the day was very heavy on his hands, that things kept happening as if he were looking in at all the things that were happening instead of being part of them. He saw himself feeding his father slowly with a spoon. He saw himself cutting crusts off sandwiches for the picnic and climbing for the blackberries. It was like playing the part in a play. He was glad when it was evening and the children went to bed. They went easily because he had promised them the most monstrous surprise of their lives tomorrow, seeing that he absolutely guaranteed they would never expect. He assured Greta that it was something she could share too, and that there was a small non-birthday present for her as well. I don't know what I would have done without you, and that's the truth, said Mary. The day just flew by for me. He was glad it had. He had arranged for 2 girls to help Teresa in the chip shop. Will Eileen not be in again? Teresa complained. Her tone was guileless. She didn't know. No, she won't. She's gone off somewhere. We'll get you these 2 young ones you've had in there before on bank holidays and high summer, he said firmly. Mrs. Billy and I are going to be down in Ryan's for a bit, so you'll know how to send one of them down there if there's any problem. But a big, bright girl like you, Teresa, you'll manage it. Don't you know it all like the back of your hand? Teresa was delighted with him. Oh, go on, Mr. Mikey, you and your Dublin chat, she said. Are we going off down to Ryan's? He asked her. He was going to make a joke and say something about stepping out together or hitting the high spots, but he felt it would have been wrong thing to do. She looked up at him, pleased and surprised that he seemed so eager. I'm not much company for you. I think we should go out, though, don't you? From the start, like, no hiding away in corners, no crawling out when people think you've got 2 heads. Be out there from the word go, after all. You haven't done anything. I failed to hold on to my husband. That's a great crime in these parts. Oh, I don't think so. Aren't they all stuck into television every night here? I think you'd have to do far more than that to be a disgrace. I hate you to be so involved in it, Mikey. You've been nothing but kindness itself, every weekend as nice as anything, and look what happens to you, caught up in the scandal, all the gossip. There won't be scandal and gossip, and that's up to you to make sure of. He heard his own voice in his ears. He thought it sounded very confident, very sure. Mary must have thought so too. You're a great help to me making all these decisions. I'm like one of those things in films that just walks about not knowing what they're at. Zombies, he said. Imagine you knowing that, Mary said. I see a lot of films, Mikey said. What else have I to do? Ryan's was crowded. He put Mary in a corner and went up to the counter. Celia was going full strength and Bart Kennedy was giving her a hand. Mikey remembered his brother's instructions about paying Bart a proper wage, and bile against Billy rose in his throat. To be able to calculate like that, to plan for her desertion, to deceive her so long. It's not like you to be short of a word, Mikey Burns. Celia was standing in front of him. She must have asked him his order and he hadn't heard. I'm sorry, he had to force his sense of outrage down before he could speak. Are you all right? Celia's voice was concerned. Mikey shook himself. He was full of brave words to his sister-in-law about how she ought to behave. Now he must do the same for himself. He could speak again, but he hadn't the heart for jokes. He gave his order and carried the pint and the glass of Snowball across to Mary. As he was passing young Biddy Brady's engagement party, Nancy Morris, of all people, put her hand out as if to stop him. Wanted him to come and tell them some funny stories. He always thought she was such a superior acting kind of a one, always looking in on herself and never having time for other people. Well, well. Not now, Nancy, he had said, and he saw her face turning away embarrassed. He hadn't meant to be so short with her, but honestly, now of all times. Here we are, he said. She had her head down looking at the floor. Look up, Mary Burns, look up and smile. She looked up and gave a watery smile. That's marvelous, but it isn't a patch on your daughters. She gave one of Greta's sudden grins, and a kind of grin that split a face in half. They both laughed. That's better, said Mikey. Now let's see what we'll do. They got out a writing pad and made out a list of things she had to do this week. Ring suppliers, their names were all on some kinds of bits of paper on various spikes around the office. Billy Burns hadn't kept any books that would gladden the heart of a taxman, but at least there was some method in his ways. They wrote out a kind of notice that she could give to anyone who called about insurance. Mr. Burns's policies are all being dealt with by the following office, followed by the name of the solicitor. She would give these to anyone with a laughing explanation that unfortunately as a mere woman she was never kept informed of the master's doings. It seemed fairly sure that he hadn't absconded with the other people's money, so his book had been passed on or sold to some other agent by now. The solicitors would know. They listed the people that they could call on to work in the takeaway and how much they should be paid. He went for 2 further pints and 2 further snowballs, and by that time they had covered every eventuality and worn themselves out. I'll sleep tonight, I'm that exhausted, Mary said, letting out that she hadn't slept the previous night. I'll sleep too, I'm less frightened, Mikey said. She looked at him gratefully. You're very, very good to me, but there's one thing you haven't mentioned at all. What's that? What about you? Will you still be coming home on the bus at weekends? I'll get off the Lilac bus before 10 every Friday with the help of God, he said. You're very different tonight. You're not always cracking jokes and making games out of things people say. I find it much easier to talk to you, or it's hard to believe it is you. Do you know what I mean? I think so, he said. Like I want to ask you, do you want to come home to Rathdown even more than at the weekends? But I don't know how to put it. If I say, will you come back all together, it looks as if I want you to come back and look after us and take it all on, and that's not it. And then if I don't ask you, you might get the notion you're not welcome. I've thought all that out too, Mikey Burns said. And what did you arrive at? She leaned over the glass with its rim of froth. She couldn't wait to hear. You're still hoping in your heart he'll come back. That it's only a bit of summer madness, that it'll be all forgotten by the end of the month. I'd like it, but I don't think it's going to happen, she said simply. So suppose I came home and settled myself in and Billy Boy came over the hill one fine day. Where would that leave us all? As we were, wouldn't it? She looked at him inquiringly. No, I'd have to run away again. There wouldn't be room for us all in the one nest. So you're not coming back to us? I always thought you had a great soft spot for us all together. She sounded sad. I'll come back for good if he isn't back for Christmas. That's the best way. That's the way to do it. He looked proud of his deductions. It's your home, she said gently. You were always welcome in it as the sun coming in the window. You say that because you're like that. My brother Billy didn't say it, did he, when he was leaving? He told you to get Bart Kennedy and pay him a proper wage. He did say it, but I didn't repeat it. I didn't want to be making you think you had to do anything. She looked troubled now. What did he say? He said, it doesn't matter what he said. He made it clear he thought of the place as your house too. I want to hear it. Why? What does it matter? We know he hardly knows what he's doing. He's half mad these days. He couldn't string words together. Well, I'd like to know anyway, please, he said simply but firmly. This wasn't the giggling, jokey man of last weekend. He said something like, Mikey's not likely to settle down anywhere with anyone at his age, and he's very good to the old man and the children love him. Maybe if he could find something for himself around here, he'd be in the place. Sure, the house is half his anyway. He has a right to it. And it was something along those lines. She didn't look at him, and he looked hard at the beer mat, which had a puzzle on it. Full of charm, my little brother, isn't he? That's what he is, your little brother. Don't ever forget that. Would it suit you, Mary, if I were to be about the place? Would it suit me? Wouldn't I love it? Isn't it what I always wanted? There's always been a living for us in that takeaway alone. You've seen the takings, and if we were working in it together. Well then, I'll come back at Christmas, that's the best. I might even get myself made redundant up at the bank and have a lump sum. Those fellows up in the bank, the porters, are fierce organized. You never know what kind of a deal they'd get for me. Wouldn't it be dull for you after Dublin? No, don't I come home for nearly half the week as it is? And maybe finding yourself a girl? She was hesitant. I think Brother Billy was right on that one. The time has passed. He smiled an ordinary smile, not a screwed up one. Rupert Green passed the table. Did you see Judy Hickey at all? He asked. No, I'm afraid we were talking. I didn't notice, Mary said. She could be around the corner behind the pillar there, Mikey pointed. Biddy Brady's party had linked arms and were singing Sailing, and Celia's mother was arriving with a golf club as if she were about to brain them. But as they all watched horrified, it turned out that she had no such intention. She was about to join in the singing and was in fact calling for one voice only, her own. I've met everyone from the Lilac bus except the one I set out to meet, grumbled Rupert. Dee Burke was just flying out the door. Miss Moritz looks as if she's had a skinful. Kev is cowering in the corner, and the rest of the cast is at the counter canoodling. If she comes in, what'll I tell her? Oh, I'll find her. I have to tell her something extraordinary. Mary and Mikey looked politely interested. He was gone. It's probably about some toadstool or mushroom. They're always talking about herbs and elderflowers and things, Mikey said. Mary laughed and tucked her bag in her arm. Won't you want another man? He said suddenly. I mean, you're still young. Won't living with a brother-in-law cramp your style? No, she said. No, I won't. I mean, even if I could have one, I can't. But I think I'm through with all that sort of thing. I think I just want a bit of peace for the children to be able to grow up happily enough, and for me to have a place here, you know, just like you said, not running away. That will do me. He remembered the dream that he had on the bus, the dream where there had been no wife, but he was in charge of the children, sending them on little messages up and down the street. He realized now there had been no Billy in the dream either. Some of the details were different, of course, but the central part was the same. He would now be safe at home with them all, and there would be no demands made on him as a man. He could just be himself, and he'd be as welcome as the sun that came in the windows. So that is the chapter on Mikey. That's his story.
Very, very nice.
Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Donna, have you read a lot of her books?
I have, yeah.
And have you finished this one that you're reading now, that you
Yes.
read today? Oh.
Yeah, I read it many, many years ago, and I've been rereading it, getting ready for this.
It was wonderful, really was.
One of the things that I've always enjoyed about Maeve Binchy is that, you know, some of her books are the true dramatic romance, you know, where there's, you know, people tearing their hair out and their lives are just over because of the love of their life didn't work out. But she's also able to tell these simple stories that are just sort of a day in the life of a regular person.
Yeah.
You know,
It is. It's like it shows so much about the sort of culture that they're living in and the values that they have.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah, I
interesting.
find that, you know, sometimes I love to read, you know, sci-fi thrillers and murder mysteries and detective stories. And sometimes reading all of that drama just gets to be a bit much.
Yes.
And so that's when I look for Maeve Binchy stories where it's just simple, a day in the life.
There's a certain beauty to it.
And the dialogue is wonderful. Her style is so, is just, yeah, it's terrific. It really is. Now, since you have read it, and I'm the slowest reader in the world, so if I do get the book, I'd forget it anyway. Do they ever become more than brother-in-law and sister-in-law?
Well, that's the thing is, you just have the one chapter. That's it.
That's it.
That's Mikey's story.
Oh,
The short story, right?
Oh,
Yeah, so you're left just kind of wondering. And the next chapter goes on to tell another one of the passengers on the Lilac bus. It tells their story.
That's great.
So,
Yeah.
One of the
I
things,
like the ending.
one of the things I liked about it so much is she took me by surprise.
Yes.
I didn't expect quite a few of the things that happened. And there's a line in there, which is another whole story for me, when Mikey says, well, I could stay here and I wouldn't have to be a man or do the man things. I assumed he meant sexually. But that's where my head took me.
yeah, I think that
other people think.
I was taken by exactly the same phrase. Yeah.
That's
yeah, I
because
agree. I think there's
our Patricia.
But the characters were very well described in such a short story. You got to know them.
yes. That's what I loved about it. Like, I could really see this whole scene going on at the pub and all the people on the bus and
Beautiful.
it being such a character.
she does put a lot of detail into her descriptions, which is so nice. All the little, you know, describing, you know, cups of tea or sitting down for a meal or picking flowers. And, you know, my kids, some of their books, I try and read along with them as a parent. And sometimes their books are so wordy with their descriptions that you get bogged down
Yes.
Exactly.
in the detail of it. But with Maeve Binchy's book, I feel like the detail that she gives, they build that scene in your mind.
It's a picture. You see a picture for sure.
And if you've ever known people like that, which I have, so I've known characters like Mikey. But what I was struck by was Mary's, her whole demeanor. Either she was in shock or, I mean, that was just so amazing, the way that she handled it with no drama at all.
Strength, character strength.
Right.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, I sure hope she goes and has a good cry somewhere.
Yeah.
But her life is sure turned upside down.
I'll cry for her.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of her just being so stoic about the whole thing that, you know, here she knew that yelling and screaming wasn't going to get her anything, that even if Mikey could get Billy to come back,
Right.
he wouldn't really be back. So there's no point in it.
It's almost British, her attitude. Almost British. Carry on. Right?
Yep, keep calm, carry on.
But then the children were going to have a stepbrother or stepsister. So the drama went on there with Billy. Or
But Billy said, "You'll never see me again."
He said, yeah, but, and again, I'm projecting today, you know, how when the children get older and they do ask where their father went, that to know that they do have a brother or a sister somewhere in England.
She'll say he left. You know, he's gone.
That gets to be a whole nother book then. You get a sequel.
Oh, this could have been the whole book. That's why I'm saying to end it there as a short story, you can just go on and on with this.
Right. And I can just imagine the other chapters must be just as interesting.
Yes.
So I'm definitely going to get the book.
It's part of why I picked Mikey's chapters, that it really just kind of ends you in a comfortable place. You kind of see that, you know, Mikey and Mary are comfortable with each other. They have a plan on what they're going to do going forward, and they're just that little bit of settled.
Very open, and very, very much family, very much, you know, attached in their own way.
And how comforting it had to be to her to know that he would be there, because obviously even before this, she thought a great deal of him. You know, it was the perfect arrangement, actually.
Yes.
He loved the kids loved him.
Right.
He was comfortable with everything. So yeah, I mean, that had to provide a lot of comfort.
And the father put the seal of approval on the whole thing.
Yes.
Which made it easier, I guess. He says, do whatever you have to do. I'm going. And I'm going now. I'll see you ladies. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mary.
Bye.